The advent of genetically modified seeds, which is only about 20 years ago in farming, is almost nothing compared to the long history of the development of seeds by farmers, going back 10,000 years to the domestication of certain plants. Initially, what they did was called artificial selection, where they simply, by walking through their fields or even in nature, they would select those plants of that species which had the traits that they thought would be desirable for them. That was mainly what happened all the way up until the early 1900s. Well, I should back up. Actually, and part of that selection then would give you all of these different varieties of a given species, often called land races, which meant that each one grew best at a particular place in the landscape.
Give an example.
An example would be the potatoes in the blank. See, I have the wrong name of that part of that country, just escaped me.
In the Andes?
I guess it was the Andes.
Peru?
Peru, yeah, is good.
Here's an example.
This is an example. The potatoes were originally domesticated in the area of today's Peru, and they developed them in all the different ecological niches that provided, including the elevations up the side of a mountain. And these became known as land races because they were highly adapted to grow in that particular part of the landscape. So the farmers, of course, were not located all in one place. They were located at different elevations up the side of a mountain. And each of those elevations provided a unique environment. And the farmer that developed the potatoes in one of those unique environments would end up with a different variety suited for production in that locality, and another farmer at a different elevation would select for a land race that was adapted to that particular environment. And so thousands of varieties of potatoes were selected for by these early farmers. And this provides a fantastic reservoir of genetic variability or biodiversity within that species. And so originally, most plant varieties were derived by this artificial selection procedure. It was just intuitive to the farmers. But then they also started to cross one variety to another variety of the same species, and that was hybridization. And they carried on this hybridization to derive yet new varieties of the species they were working on. And again, it was just intuitive. What worked, worked. And it was only until about the early 1900s, I think about the 1920s in the US, that this hybridization was done for corn in a commercial way. They commercialized this process, and when the farmers planted these hybrid varieties of corn, they could no longer save seed as had been done historically for maize and for all other plants that were useful to farmers. And so a major change concerning seed used by farmers occurred in about 1920s and 30s in the US, when hybridization of different corn varieties was done in a commercial way by companies. And they found out that this so-called hybrid corn made from crossing two varieties of corn was much more productive in bushels per acre than the original two strains. And farmers could not save those seeds because they do not breed true. You don't get the same thing the next generations. So they were sort of locked into. They had to make a choice. If they wanted the increased yield for hybrid corn, then they had to buy that seed from the hybrid seed corn companies every year. But they found it profitable to do that. Is that good enough? There's a third kind of seed revolution that occurred starting only about 20 years ago when Monsanto and other companies that were initially pesticide companies developed what are called genetically modified seed, or concerning the organisms, they're called GMOs. Now, this was a radical change of what had been done in the previous 10,000 years. Radical because a gene could be what we call cloned from one species and transferred into the DNA, into the chromosomes of a different species. And this is called genetically modified, but more specifically, if the gene comes from a different species, it's called transgenesis. The gene is a transgene. And there's been two major classes of those that have been brought forth by Monsanto and other companies. One is for herbicide resistance in corn and soybeans and cotton and a few other crops, and for insect resistance in corn and cotton as well. Now, this is radically different because it is not part of what we call classical plant breeding. And it is really, these plants are very different from the plants that were used before and that are actually the ones that were then transformed into the GMO. They're different, first of all, because they carry that gene. In the case of herbicide resistance and insect resistance, the genes come from bacteria. And furthermore, during the process, and it's a complicated cell biology, molecular biology process, the genome, the DNA, the chromosomes of the plant that's having the new gene introduced into it is what I call somewhat scrambled. Hundreds to thousands of mutations occur. So this is really, I think, a major problem in using these kinds of seeds, plus the fact that they cost much more for the farmer to plant than the non-genetically modified plant that they were derived from.
Okay. The third. Remember, look at me.
The third aspect of development of seeds for farmers came with the introduction of genetically modified seeds about 20 years ago. Here in the Midwest, corn and soybeans were the two targets. And there were two major classes of GMOs, genetically modified plants or seeds, that they, meaning the companies, developed. One of them is for what's called herbicide tolerance of the corn or soybeans, and the other is for production of insecticide by the plant in the case of corn. Now, in both processes, a bacterial gene is isolated and then transferred to the recipient species, corn or soybeans. But this is done in a complicated manner in the laboratory involving molecular and cellular techniques. This is a very different procedure than all of the classical plant breeding systems that were used by farmers and also by researchers in the 10,000 years preceding these last 20 years. Now, let me go, why did the farmers, some farmers, embrace these last 20 years? Now, let me go, why did the farmers, some farmers, embrace these two new technologies? The one is for herbicide tolerance, means that the plant that you want, that is the corn plant, is not killed by the herbicide that is used, but all of the weeds are. So the corn plant was genetically engineered to be tolerant to the herbicide. The most commonly used one almost solely used one to date, Roundup. In the other case of insecticide, they engineered the plant so that by using, again, bacterial genes from a different bacterium, genes that produced proteins which themselves were insecticides. So in that case, the pesticide, the insecticide, is made by the plant itself. In both cases, herbicide tolerance as well as the insect resistance, a new toxin is being released into the environment. In herbicide resistance, it is the herbicide Roundup, and now more recently, other ones. And in the case of the insecticide-producing plants, the new toxin, I call them, the new toxin is the Bt toxins themselves. When these two types of genetically modified plants were produced about 20 years ago, the companies that produced them made two major promises or claims. One was that they would result in greater profit, greater yields, and therefore greater profit for the farmer. And secondly, that they would bring about the less use of pesticides. Because even prior to that, farmers were spraying herbicides and they were spraying insecticides and fungicides, many kinds of pesticides. It may have been true in the early years of this work that that was true, but recent studies have shown that neither of those worked out. There has really been no clear increase in yields by using GMOs compared to the previous not using GMOs, and there has been actually an increase in the use of herbicides and maybe about an even use of insecticides, and therefore an overall increase in the use of pesticides. And so I'm very dubious of any additional claims that come from the industries, the companies that make these genetically modified seeds.
Stop.
Now, these two different classes of GM corn and soybeans were successful for a few years. But it seems as if some people, although I think most people do understand, that if you work against nature instead of with nature, that Mother Nature always wins. And Mother Nature always wins because evolution continues to occur. And so what has happened is that the weeds that were initially killed by Roundup have developed a resistance to Roundup and are no longer killed. Likewise, in the case of the insecticides made by the strains that make their own insecticide, one of the main pests that they are used against is the rootworm in corn. And now these rootworms themselves have developed a resistance to these insecticides made by the plant. So this is the problem with what I call technological fixes. Technological fixes always work for a while until Mother Nature does what she always does, which is to continue the process of evolution by natural selection. And natural selection, just as in the case with antibiotic resistance in bacteria, the same for pesticide, for resistance to herbicides and resistance to pesticides made within the plant. I don't know if in both of these two classes of genetically modified plants that I've discussed, the companies started naturally, of course, with simple one gene, one protein, one trait situations because they're the easy ones to approach with genetic technology. But in reality, most of the important plant traits for resistance to various kinds of insects and other things, as well as yield, are complex traits involving many different genes and involving all kinds of interaction among those genes, as well as with the environment, and many other complicated aspects of the way cells work. And so when they now turn around and say we're going to genetically engineer plants so that they will be drought resistant, or we're going to engineer plants so that they'll be more nutritious, these are seldom, if ever, one gene traits. And so it's going to be exceedingly complicated and maybe impossible to get in all the different genes you want to put in to accomplish that. But classical plant breeding has been doing it for 10,000 years. And actually, most of what we benefit from in terms of genetic research to give us increased yield, resistance to pests, and drought resistance, and so on and so forth, has come from classical plant breeding, not from this new era of genetic modification by inserting genes from other species.
Okay, I want you to start a sentence.
Farmers themselves, over the centuries, in all parts of the world, have perfected methods of agriculture that obviously do not need GMOs, and they don't need any of the aspects of industrial farming, that is, synthetic pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. This kind of farming is called organic farming or agroecology, as contrasted with what I call industrial farming. And we know from numerous scientific studies, and I think even more importantly, the experience of the farmers themselves all over the world, is that it works and it's way more sustainable. I can give you those 5 or 6 results from. Sometimes I think we worship too much at the altar of the scientist. And we should realize that the very first scientists were the farmers, starting 10,000 years ago. They were scientists right out in nature, observing what nature was showing them and building on it, always building on it. It's what some people call the wisdom of our elders. And I often think that we've lost so much through technology by not listening to the wisdom of our elders. A little bit later, one of our wise elders, who is still alive today, is Wendell Berry. My favorite quote from Wendell Berry is, he says that every farmer should consider the genius of the place. By that he means what was the ecosystem before it became a farm, and to use that as their guide for the kind of farming practices that they will follow. And I think it follows naturally from that if you do that, you do not try to overwhelm nature, to battle nature, to try to take charge of nature, but instead you work in concert with nature. Now, we can't have a farm and duplicate the ecosystem that was there before, but we can certainly think about what was there and how should that help us. For example, in this part of Illinois, it was all tall grass prairie, almost all tall grass prairie. It's now farmland of corn and soybeans. So we can't completely go back to having both corn and soybeans and tall grass prairie, but we can think about what we learned from the tall grass prairie, and that is that built the soil, built the health of the soil, and we should use a farming practice that builds the health of the soil, working with nature as best we can, rather than one that destroys the health of the soil. I don't know, I got off on a tangent, but so the one view of farming comes from, or is practiced by organic farmers, and they view that all the wisdom comes from nature, and they're going to work with the wisdom of nature the best they can to carry on their farming and pass it on to the future generations. The industrial farmers, I don't think, and certainly the GMO companies, do not really think that nature's in charge and that they can work with nature. Instead, they tend to embrace the technological fixes that try to fix the things that they think are wrong with farming or are a problem in farming and which work against what the true nature of farming is. That's not quite. The opposing view is, rather than working with nature, to try to find technological fixes that involve nature and work against nature. So if you have weeds, you have a technological fix of killing the weeds with a herbicide. Or, on the other hand, if you have a problem of insects in your field, rather than work with nature, you have a technological fix to have the plant make its own insecticide and kill the insects. But these technological fixes always fail, where I think the farmers that practice working with nature, their techniques do not fail. When they first came out with the genetically modified soybeans that were resistant to the Roundup herbicide called Roundup Ready soybeans, they did an early study which showed that actually using the GMO plus the Roundup did not give any greater yield or profit than the previously used non-GMO soybeans. And after that, some researcher went around and talked to the farmers that were using the GMO, and they said, here's the results that have been found. Are you going to stop using the GMO and go back to your non-GMO? The vast majority of those farmers said, no, I'm going to keep using that GMO. And actually the reason then, following up, they asked them, well, why? And what they said was convenience. They wanted to be able to spray the herbicide rather than go out there and cultivate on the tractor. So there is some things that the industrial farmers like. They like those kind of conveniences. And they're willing to pay the price, I think, of less profit and poisoning their fields and their environment with these pesticides. And I use the word poison advisedly because they are poisons, and they don't just affect their target organism. There's only a relatively small number of traits in all organisms where one gene determines one enzyme, which in turn determines one trait. And we hear about those because they're easy to study and easy to do. But in agronomy, all of the agronomically important traits are multi-gene that interact with each other and with the environment to produce the trait. Recently, Monsanto did come out with a one gene supposedly to give drought resistance. But as I just said about the Rodale study, we know we can get greater drought resistance by using organic farming, by improving the soil, the water holding capacity of the soil. And furthermore, there are studies in many places, including in Kenya, where they have developed multiple strains of maize, corn, that are adapted locally for the different environments, that they have selected for drought resistance, because it's a big problem there, by classical plant breeding, and the amount of resistance that they get to drought is better than what Monsanto's one gene drought resistant strain is. So much of the work in this area is simply not going to work because the genetics is complicated. To give an example of a trait that is determined, controlled by many, probably hundreds of genes interacting with each other in the corn plant, has been the history of the increased yield of corn since, say, the 1920s. When hybrid corn came in at about the 1940s, there was a definite increase in yield per acre average across the United States. Since then, it has continued to increase. It's not a perfect straight line, but it's pretty darn close, of about 1.7 bushels per year. Now, how did that come about? About a half of that is due to cultural practices of various kinds, 30-inch rows instead of 36-inch rows. but half of that has come from classical plant breeding, which they selected over and over and over again for that trait of yield. They just select for the trait. But of course, as they're selecting for the trait, they're selecting for all the different, what we call alleles or kinds of genes throughout the corn genome. And when GMOs came in, I've written a letter about this, the person claimed that there had been an explosion of yield in corn. If you look at the curve, 20 years ago, there was no change in the shape of the curve. It just kept going along due to classical plant breeding, not due to GMOs.
Is it true? Go ahead.
One of the issues that comes up frequently about GMOs is some people say they're safe. And the companies that make the GM plants will claim that their GMs are just as safe. They are no different from the non-GMO from which they were derived. But then when it comes to filing a patent, or when it comes to talking about advantages of their strains, they say, yes, they deserve to be patented. Yes, they're better. So on the one hand, they say they're the same when they need to make that argument. On the other hand, they say that they're different when they need to make that argument.
Can you add the sentence, you can't have it both ways?
You can't, yeah. It's clear that these companies cannot have it both ways and be logical.
Okay.
Concerning the technology that's used to make GM seeds, the GM companies often say that that event of making a GM plant or seed is very precise, is the word that they use. They even claim that it's more precise than classical plant breeding. But if you look into it, what you find is that when that gene is moved from the bacterial species into a particular plant variety, that there are two major classes of mutations that occur. One around the site of insert of the new gene into the host chromosome, and then mutations that occur clear across the genome. And these mutations in total add up to hundreds to thousands of new mutations that have occurred. Now, some people might say, well, so what? The so what is that natural selection has, over the hundreds of thousands, millions of years, selected for the optimal genotype, the optimal DNA sequences for genes through evolution. It's plain old natural selection. And when those are changed by random mutations, such as those occurring during the process of creating the GMO, almost all of those mutations are harmful to the plant, not beneficial. So what the GMO companies have to do is to take many of the new GMO trait plants of a given trait and plant them out, and determines which ones are not hardy, which ones are too short, too tall, too one thing or another, and try to weed out those just by looking at the plants themselves. And so I still prefer classical plant breeding rather than the GMO approach.
Go ahead.
We talked about the fact that originally it was the farmers themselves that developed all the new varieties of seeds of a given species. But in more recent times, after the creation of the land-grant universities, one in each state, I think, part of the role of the faculty at those universities was working with the farmers to develop new varieties of all the farm crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, oats, barley, etc. And that was one of their main missions. That mission has now been largely replaced by the large GMO companies. They contribute a lot of money to the universities, both to the professors to do their research and to the graduate students to support them. And that research is always to make more and different GMOs. And this in turn has brought about a huge consolidation of the seed corn industry. There used to be enormous numbers of seed companies for everything, even, especially for vegetables, I would say. And now so much consolidation has occurred because the big ones, such as Monsanto and Dow, they buy out these smaller companies and incorporate their inventory into their own seeds. And so it's becoming more and more difficult, especially, say, for corn and soybean farmers, to buy a non-GMO variety because of this consolidation. And of course, those companies don't want to sell a non-GMO. They want to sell their higher-priced GMO. In response to that, fortunately, farmers and small companies working together are starting to, and already is happening, producing non-GMO seeds again for all the major commodity crops. The major GM crops are corn, soybeans, canola, cotton, and sugar beets. All of these enter into our processed food one way or another, probably corn and soybeans being the two major ones. So many people don't realize how much of the processed food that they buy at a grocery store contains these GM crops. I don't know.
Go ahead.
There are two major kinds of corn that are raised. The minority kind is the kind we eat directly as corn on the cob. That is sweet corn. The other, and that's only about 1% of the corn. The other 99% of the corn is what farmers call field corn. And of that 99%, about 50% is used as animal feed. That is, to feed beef, swine, and poultry. Another 40% is used in ethanol plants to make ethanol to put in gasoline for our cars and other vehicles. That leaves less than 10% of the corn left over, and it is used mainly in processed food. The two main uses, I think, are corn oil and corn sweeteners, generally called high fructose corn syrup. And so they are added to a lot of the processed food that we eat, that we buy in the grocery store. And most people don't stop to think, I don't think, that that's what they're eating, that they are eating genetically modified corn. In terms of acreage of corn, field corn grown in the U.S., roughly 93% of it is genetically modified. The same is true for soybeans. Roughly 93 or 94% is genetically modified. I should have stuck with just 93%. I'm
Say it
sorry.
again. Go ahead.
Roughly 93% of the soybeans is also genetically modified. So it's almost impossible, unless it's labeled as non-GMO, to avoid food with either corn or soybeans in it in one form or another that is not genetically modified. Therefore, if you buy processed food that contains any products made from corn or soybeans, you have a 93% roughly probability that you're eating genetically modified corn and or soybeans.
Go ahead.
A major claim of the GMO industries is that we need these GMOs to, quote unquote, feed the world. On the other hand, there is ample evidence, especially from United Nations reports, that the best way to do that is not by growing GMOs and by industrial agriculture, but by using what I call organic agriculture, but they usually call agroecology. That's
good.
I think most people that have studied this would agree that the way to feed the world is not for the U.S. commodity farmers to try to feed the rest of the world, but rather to have the individual small family farmers all over the world feed their families and their neighbors in a sustainable way, growing not commodity crops, but rather growing the most important things for our diet: vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes, grains that are high protein, and none of that requires GMOs or industrial agriculture.